The 8th book, entitled Urania. The Greeks engaged in the sea service were the following. The Athenians furnished 127 vessels to the fleet, which were manned in part by the Plataeans, who, though unskilled in such matters, were led by their active and daring spirit to undertake this duty. The Corinthians furnished a contingent of 40 vessels, the Megarians sent 20, the Chalcidians also manned 20, which had been furnished to them by the Athenians. The Aeginetans came with 18, the Sicyonians with 12, the Lacedaemonians with 10, the Epidaurians with 8, the Erythraeans with 7, the Troezenians with 5, the Styrians with 2, and the Chians with 2 triremes and 2 pentecontas. Last of all, the Locrians of Opus came in aid with a squadron of 7 pentecontas. Such were the nations which furnished vessels to the fleet now at Artemisium, and in mentioning them I have given the number of ships furnished by each. The total number of the ships thus brought together, without counting the pentecontas, was 271, and the captain who had the chief command over the whole fleet was Eurybiades, the son of Euryclides. He was furnished by Sparta, since the allies had said that if a Lacedaemonian did not take the command, they would break up the fleet, for never would they serve under the Athenians. From the first, even earlier than the time when the embassy went to Sicily to solicit alliance, there had been a talk of entrusting the Athenians with the command at sea. But the allies were averse to the plan. Wherefore the Athenians didn't press it, for there was nothing they had so much at heart as the salvation of Greece, and they knew that if they quarrelled among themselves about the command, Greece would be brought to ruin. Herein they judged rightly, for internal strife is a thing as much worse than war, carried on by a united people, as war itself is worse than peace. The Athenians, therefore, being so persuaded, didn't push their claims, but waived them, so long as they were in such great need of aid from the other Greeks. And they afterwards showed their motive, for at a time when the Persians had been driven from Greece, and were now threatened by the Greeks in their own country, they took occasion of the insolence of Pausanias to deprive the Lacedaemonians of their leadership. This, however, happened afterwards. At the present time, the Greeks, on their arrival at Artemisium, when they saw the number of the ships which lay at anchor near Aphetae, and the abundance of troops everywhere, feeling disappointed that matters had gone with the barbarians so far otherwise than they had expected, and full of alarm at what they saw, began to speak of drawing back from Artemisium towards the inner parts of their country. So when the Euboeans heard what was in debate, they went to Eurybiades and besought him to wait a few days, while they removed their children and their slaves to a place of safety. But as they found that they prevailed nothing, they left him and went to Themistocles, the Athenian commander, to whom they gave a bribe of 30 talents, on his promise that the fleet should remain and risk a battle in defence of Euboea. And Themistocles succeeded in detaining the fleet in the way which I will now relate. He made over to Eurybiades 5 talents out of the 30 paid him, which he gave as if they came from himself. And having in this way gained over the admiral, he addressed himself to Adimantus, the son of Archytas, the Corinthian leader, who was the only remonstrant now, and who still threatened to sail away from Artemisium and not wait for the other captains. Addressing himself to this man, Themistocles said, with an oath, "Thou forsake us? By no means. I'll pay thee better for remaining than the Mede would for leaving thy friends." And straightway he sent on board the ship of Adimantus a present of 3 talents of silver. So these 2 captains were won by gifts, and came over to the views of Themistocles, who was thereby enabled to gratify the wishes of the Euboeans. He likewise made his own gain on the occasion, for he kept the rest of the money, and no one knew of it. The commanders who took the gifts thought that the sums were furnished by Athens, and had been sent to be used in this way. Thus it came to pass that the Greeks stayed at Euboea, and there gave battle to the enemy. Now the battle was on this wise. The barbarians reached Aphetae early in the afternoon, and then saw, as they had previously heard reported, that a fleet of Greek ships, weak in number, lay at Artemisium. At once they were eager to engage, fearing that the Greeks would fly, and hoping to capture them before they should get away. They didn't, however, think it wise to make straight for the Greek station, lest the enemy should see them as they bore down and betake themselves to flight immediately, in which case they might close in before they came up with the fugitives, and so they might get clean off and make their escape from them, whereas the Persians were minded not to let a single soul slip through their hands. They therefore contrived a plan which was the following. They detached 200 of their ships from the rest, and to prevent the enemy from seeing them start, sent them round outside the island of Skyrthos to make the circuit of Euboea by Caphareus and Geraistus, and so to reach the Euripus. By this plan they thought to enclose the Greeks on every side, for the ships detached would block up the only way by which they could retreat, while the others would press upon them in front. With these designs, therefore, they dispatched the 200 ships, while they themselves waited, since they didn't mean to attack the Greeks upon that day, or until they knew, by signal, of the arrival of the detachment which had been ordered to sail round Euboea. Meanwhile they made a muster of the other ships at Ephetai. Now the Persians had with them a man named Silius, a native of Scione, who was the most expert diver of his day. At the time of the shipwreck off Mount Pelion, he had recovered for the Persians a great part of what they lost, and at the same time he had taken care to obtain for himself a good share of the treasure. He had for some time been wishing to go over to the Greeks, but no good opportunity had offered till now, when the Persians were making the muster of their ships. In what way he contrived to reach the Greeks, I am not able to say for certain. I marvel much if the tale that is commonly told be true. 'Tis said he dived into the sea at Ephetai, and didn't once come to the surface till he reached Artemisium, a distance of nearly 80 furlongs. Now many things are related to this man which are plainly false, but some of the stories seem to be true. My own opinion is that on this occasion he made the passage to Artemisium in a boat. However this might be, Silius no sooner reached Artemisium than he gave the Greek captains a full account of the damage done by the storm, and likewise told them of the ships sent to make the circuit of Euboea. So the Greeks, on receiving these tidings, held a council, whereat, after much debate, it was resolved that they should stay quiet for the present where they were, and remain at their moorings, but that after midnight they should put out to sea and encounter the ships which were on their way round the island. Later in the day, when they found that no one meddled with them, they formed a new plan, which was to wait till near evening and then sail out against the main body of the barbarians, for the purpose of trying their mode of fight and skill in manoeuvring. When the Persian commanders and crews saw the Greeks thus boldly sailing towards them with their few ships, they thought them possessed with madness, and went out to meet them, expecting, as indeed seemed likely enough, that they should take all their vessels with the greatest ease. The Greek ships were so few, and their own so far outnumbered them, and sailed so much better, that they resolved, seeing their advantage, to encompass their foe on every side. And now such of the Ionians as wished well to the Grecian cause, and served in the Persian fleet unwillingly, seeing their countrymen surrounded, were sorely distressed, for they felt sure that not one of them would ever make his escape, so poor an opinion had they of the strength of the Greeks. On the other hand, such as saw with pleasure the attack on Greece now vied eagerly with each other which should be the first to make prize of an Athenian ship, and thereby to secure himself a rich reward from the king. For through both the hosts none were so much accounted of as the Athenians. The Greeks at a signal brought the sterns of their ships together into a small compass, and turned their prows on every side towards the barbarians. After which, at a second signal, although enclosed within a narrow space and closely pressed upon by the foe, yet they fell bravely to work, and captured 30 ships of the barbarians, at the same time taking prisoner Phileon, the son of Chersis, and brother of Gorgas, king of Salamis, a man of much repute in the fleet. The first who made prize of a ship of the enemy was Lycomedes, the son of Aeschrias, an Athenian, who was afterwards adjudged the meed of valour. Victory, however, was still doubtful when night came on and put a stop to the combat. The Greeks sailed back to Artemisium, and the barbarians returned to Aphetai, much surprised at the result, which was far other than they had looked for. In this battle only one of the Greeks who fought on the side of the king deserted and joined his countrymen. This was Antidorus of Lemnos, whom the Athenians rewarded for his desertion by the present of a piece of land in Salamis. Evening had barely closed in when a heavy rain, it was about midsummer, began to fall, which continued the whole night, with terrible thunderings and lightnings from Mount Pelion. The bodies of the slain and the broken pieces of the damaged ships were drifted in the direction of Amphitai and floated about the prows of the vessels there, disturbing the action of the oars. The barbarians, hearing the storm, were greatly dismayed, expecting certainly to perish, as they had fallen into such a multitude of misfortunes. For before they were well recovered from the tempest and the wreck of their vessels off Mount Pelion, they had been surprised by a sea fight which had taxed all their strength, and now the sea fight was scarcely over, when they were exposed to floods of rain and the rush of swollen streams into the sea and violent thunderings. If, however, they who lay at Amphitai passed a comfortless night, far worse were the sufferings of those who had been sent to make the circuit of Euboea, inasmuch as the storm fell on them out at sea, whereby the issue was indeed calamitous. They were sailing along near the hollows of Euboea when the wind began to rise and the rain to pour. Overpowered by the force of the gale and driven they knew not whither, at the last they fell upon rocks, heaven so contriving in order that the Persian fleet might not greatly exceed the Greek, but be brought nearly to its level. This squadron therefore was entirely lost about the hollows of Euboea. The barbarians at Amphitai were glad when day dawned, and remained in quiet at their station, content if they might enjoy a little peace after so many sufferings. Meanwhile, there came to the aid of the Greeks a reinforcement of 53 ships from Attica. Their arrival and the news, which reached Artemisium about the same time, of the complete destruction by the storm of the ships sent to sail round Euboea, greatly cheered the spirits of the Greek sailors. So they waited again till the same hour as the day before, and once more, putting out to sea, attacked the enemy. This time they fell in with some Cilician vessels, which they sank. When night came on, they withdrew to Artemisium. The third day was now come, and the captains of the barbarians, ashamed that so small a number of ships should harass their fleet, and afraid of the anger of Xerxes, instead of waiting for the others to begin the battle, weighed anchor themselves and advanced against the Greeks about the hour of noon, with shouts encouraging one another. Now it happened that these sea fights took place on the very same days with the combats at Thermopylae, and as the aim of the struggle was in the one case to maintain the pass, so in the other it was to defend the Euripus. While the Greeks, therefore, exhorted one another not to let the barbarians burst in upon Greece, these latter shouted to their fellows to destroy the Grecian fleet and get possession of the channel. And now the fleet of Xerxes advanced in good order to the attack, while the Greeks on their side remained quite motionless at Artemisium. The Persians therefore spread themselves and came forward in a half-moon, seeking to encircle the Greeks on all sides, and thereby prevent them from escaping. The Greeks, when they saw this, sailed out to meet their assailants, and the battle forthwith began. In this engagement the two fleets contended with no clear advantage to either, for the armament of Xerxes injured itself by its own greatness, the vessels falling into disorder and ofttimes running foul of one another. Yet still they didn't give way, but made a stout fight, since the crews felt it would indeed be a disgrace to turn and fly from a fleet so inferior in number. The Greeks therefore suffered much, both in ships and men, but the barbarians experienced a far larger loss of each. So the fleet separated after such a combat as I've described. On the side of Xerxes, the Egyptians distinguished themselves above all the combatants, for besides performing many other noble deeds, they took 5 vessels from the Greeks with their crews on board. On the side of the Greeks, the Athenians bore off the meed of valour, and among them the most distinguished was Clinias, the son of Alcibiades, who served at his own charge with 200 men, on board a vessel which he had himself furnished. The 2 fleets, on separating, hastened very gladly to their anchorage grounds. The Greeks indeed, when the battle was over, became masters of the bodies of the slain and the wrecks of the vessels, but they had been so roughly handled, especially the Athenians, 1/2 of whose vessels had suffered damage, that they determined to break up from their station and withdraw to the inner parts of their country. Then Themistocles, who thought that if the Ionian and Carian ships could be detached from the barbarian fleet, the Greeks might be well able to defeat the rest, called the captains together. They met upon the seashore, where the Euboeans were now assembling their flocks and herds, and here Themistocles told them he thought that he knew of a plan whereby he could detach from the king those who were of most worth among his allies. This was all that he disclosed to them of his plan at that time. Meanwhile, looking to the circumstances in which they were, he advised them to slaughter as many of the Euboean cattle as they liked, for it was better, he said, that their own troops should enjoy them than the enemy, and to give orders to their men to kindle the fires as usual. With regard to the retreat, he said that he would take upon himself to watch the proper moment, and would manage matters so that they should return to Greece without loss. These words pleased the captains, so they had the fires lighted and began the slaughter of the cattle. The Euboeans, until now, had made light of the oracle of Bacchus, as though it had been void of all significancy, and had neither removed their goods from the island, nor yet taken them into their strong places, as they would most certainly have done if they had believed that war was approaching. By this neglect they had brought their affairs into the very greatest danger. And now the oracle of which I speak ran as follows: When o'er the main shall be thrown a bibulous yoke by a stranger, be thou ware, and drive from Euboea the goats' loud bleating. So, as the Euboeans had paid no regard to this oracle when the evils approached and impended, now that they had arrived, the worst was likely to befall them. While the Greeks were employed in the way described above, the scout who had been on the watch at Trachis arrived at Artemisium. For the Greeks had employed 2 watchers. Polyas, a native of Antikyra, had been stationed off Artemisium with a rowboat at his command, ready to sail at any moment, his orders being that if an engagement took place by sea, he should convey the news at once to the Greeks at Thermopylae. And in like manner, Abronicus, the son of Lysicles, an Athenian, had been stationed with a Triaconta near Leonidas to be ready in case of disaster befalling the land force, to carry tidings of it to Artemisium. It was this Abronicus who now arrived with news of what had befallen Leonidas and those who were with him. When the Greeks heard the tidings, they no longer delayed to retreat, but withdrew in the order wherein they had been stationed, the Corinthians leading, and the Athenians sailing last of all. And now Themistocles chose out the swiftest sailors from among the Athenian vessels, and proceeding to the various watering places along the coast, cut inscriptions on the rocks, which were read by the Ionians the day following on their arrival at Artemisium. The inscriptions ran thus: Men of Ionia, ye do wrong to fight against your own fathers, and to give your help to enslave Greece. We beseech you therefore to come over, if possible, to our side. If you cannot do this, then we pray you stand aloof from the contest yourselves, and persuade the Carians to do the like. If neither of these things be possible, and you are hindered by a force too strong to resist from venturing upon desertion, at least, when we come to blows, fight backwardly, remembering that you are sprung from us, and that it was through you we first provoked the hatred of the barbarian. Themistocles, in putting up these inscriptions, looked, I believe, to two chances. Either Xerxes wouldn't discover them, in which case they might bring over the Ionians to the side of the Greeks, or they would be reported to him and made a ground of accusation against the Ionians, who would thereupon be distrusted and would not be allowed to take part in the sea fights. Shortly after the cutting of the inscriptions, a man of Histiaia went in a merchant ship to Aphetai and told the Persians that the Greeks had fled from Artemisium. Disbelieving his report, the Persians kept the man a prisoner, while they sent some of their fastest vessels to see what had happened. These brought back word how matters stood, whereupon at sunrise the whole fleet advanced together in a body, and sailed to Artemisium, where they remained till midday, after which they went on to Histiaia. That city fell into their hands immediately, and they shortly overran the various villages upon the coast in the district of Helopia, which was part of the Histiaean territory. It was while they were at this station that a herald reached them from Xerxes, whom he had sent after making the following dispositions with respect to the bodies of those who fell at Thermopylae. Of the 20,000 who had been slain on the Persian side, he left 1,000 upon the field, while he buried the rest in trenches, and these he carefully filled up with earth and hid with foliage, that the sailors might not see any signs of them. The herald, on reaching Histiaia, caused the whole force to be collected together, and spake thus to them: Comrades, King Xerxes gives permission to all who please to quit their posts and see how he fights with the senseless men who think to overthrow his armies. No sooner had these words been uttered than it became difficult to get a boat, so great was the number of those who desired to see the sight. Such as went, crossed the strait, and, passing among the heaps of dead, in this way viewed the spectacle. Many Helots were included in the slain, but every one imagined that the bodies were all either Lacedaemonians or Thespians. However, no one was deceived by what Xerxes had done with his own dead. It was indeed, most truly, a laughable device. On the one side 1,000 men were seen lying about the field, on the other 4,000 crowded together into one spot. This day, then, was given up to sightseeing. On the next, the seamen embarked on board their ships and sailed back to Histiaia, while Xerxes and his army proceeded upon their march. There came now a few deserters from Arcadia to join the Persians, poor men who had nothing to live on and were in want of employment. The Persians brought them into the king's presence, and there inquired of them, by a man who acted as their spokesman, what the Greeks were doing. The Arcadians answered, "They're holding the Olympic Games, seeing the athletic sports and the chariot races." "And what," said the man, "is the prize for which they contend?" "An olive wreath," returned the others, "which is given to the man who wins." On hearing this, Stritanteichmes, the son of Artabanus, uttered a speech which was in truth most noble, but which caused him to be taxed with cowardice by King Xerxes. Hearing the men say that the prize was not money but a wreath of olive, he couldn't forbear from explaining before them all, "Good heavens, Mardonius, what manner of men are these against whom thou hast brought us to fight? Men who contend with one another, not for money, but for honour." A little before this, and just after the blow had been struck at Thermopylae, a herald was sent into Phocis by the Thessalians, who had always been on bad terms with the Phocians, and especially since their last overthrow. For it wasn't many years previous to this invasion of Greece by the king that the Thessalians with their allies entered Phocis in full force, but were defeated by the Phocians in an engagement wherein they were very roughly handled. The Phocians, who had with them a soothsayer, Teleas of Elis, were blocked up in the mountain of Parnassus when the following stratagem was contrived for them by their Elean ally. He took 600 of their bravest men, and whitened their bodies and their arms with chalk. Then, instructing them to slay every one whom they should meet that was not whitened like themselves, he made a night attack upon the Thessalians. No sooner did the Thessalian sentries, who were the first to see them, behold this strange sight, than, imagining it to be a prodigy, they were all filled with affright. From the sentries the alarm spread to the army, which was seized with such a panic that the Phocians killed 4,000 of them, and became masters of their dead bodies and shields. Of the shields, one half were sent as an offering to the temple at Abi, the other half were deposited at Delphi, while from the 10th part of the booty gained in the battle were made the gigantic figures which stand round the tripod in front of the Delphic shrine, and likewise the figures of the same size and character at Abi. Besides this slaughter of the Thessalian foot when it was blockading them, the Phocians had dealt a blow to their horse upon its invading their territory, from which they had never recovered. There's a pass near the city of Hyampolis where the Phocians, having dug a broad trench, filled up the void with empty wine jars, after which they covered the place with mould, so that the ground all looked alike, and then awaited the coming of the Thessalians. These, thinking to destroy the Phocians at one sweep, rushed rapidly forward and became entangled in the wine jars, which broke the legs of their horses. The Thessalians had therefore a double cause of quarrel with the Phocians, when they dispatched the herald above mentioned, who thus delivered his message. At length acknowledge, ye men of Phocis, that ye may not think to match with us. In times past, when it pleased us to hold with the Greeks, we had always the vantage over you, and now our influence is such with the barbarian that if we choose it, you will lose your country, and, what is even worse, you will be sold as slaves. However, though we can now do with you exactly as we like, we are willing to forget our wrongs. Quit them with a payment of 50 talents of silver, and we undertake to ward off the evils which threaten your country. Such was the message which the Thessalians sent. The Phocians were the only people in these parts who had not espoused the cause of the Medes, and it's my deliberate opinion that the motive which swayed them was none other, neither more nor less, than their hatred of the Thessalians. For had the Thessalians declared in favour of the Greeks, I believe that the men of Phocis would have joined the Median side. As it was, when the message arrived, the Phocians made answer that they would not pay anything. It was open to them, equally with the Thessalians, to make common cause with the Medes, if they only chose so to do. But they would never of their own free will become traitors to Greece. On the return of this answer, the Thessalians, full of wrath against the Phocians, offered themselves as guides to the barbarian army, and led them forth from Trachinia into Doris. In this place there is a narrow tongue of Dorian territory, not more than 30 furlongs across, interposed between Melis and Phocis. It's the tract in ancient times called Dryopis, and the land of which it's a part is the mother country of the Dorians in the Peloponnese. This territory the barbarians didn't plunder, for the inhabitants had espoused their side, and besides, the Thessalians wished that they should be spared. From Doris they marched forward into Phocis, but here the inhabitants didn't fall into their power, for some of them had taken refuge in the high grounds of Parnassus, one summit of which, called Tithorea, standing quite by itself, not far from the city of Neon, is well fitted to give shelter to a large body of men, and had now received a number of the Phocians with their movables, while the greater portion had fled to the country of the Ozolian Locrians, and placed their goods in the city called Amphissa, which lies above the Crisian plain. The land of Phocis, however, was entirely overrun, for the Thessalians led the Persian army through the whole of it, and wherever they went, the country was wasted with fire and sword, the cities and even the temples being wilfully set alight by the troops. The march of the army lay along the valley of the Cephissus, and here they ravaged far and wide, burning the towns of Trymus, Caradra, Erocus, Tethronium, Amphicaia, Neon, Pediais, Tritaeus, Elatia, Hyampolis, Parapotami, and Abi. At the last named place there was a temple of Apollo, very rich and adorned with a vast number of treasures and offerings. There was likewise an oracle there in those days, as indeed there is at the present time. This temple the Persians plundered and burnt, and here they captured a number of the Phocians before they could reach the hills, and caused the death of some of their women by ill usage. After passing Parapotami, the barbarians marched to Peloponnese, and now the army separated into two bodies, whereof one, which was the more numerous and the stronger of the two, marched under Xerxes himself towards Athens, entering Boeotia by the country of the Orchomenans. The Boeotians had one and all embraced the cause of the Medes, and their towns were in the possession of Macedonian garrisons, whom Alexander had sent there to make it manifest to Xerxes that the Boeotians were on the Median side. Such then was the road followed by one division of the barbarians. The other division took guides and proceeded towards the temple of Delphi, keeping Mount Parnassus on their right hand. They too laid waste such parts of Phocis as they passed through, burning the city of the Panopeans, together with those of the Dolians and of the Iolidae. This body had been detached from the rest of the army and made to march in this direction, for the purpose of plundering the Delphian temple and conveying to King Xerxes the riches which were there laid up. For Xerxes, as I am informed, was better acquainted with what there was worthy of note at Delphi than even with what he had left in his own house. So many of those about him were continually describing the treasures, more especially the offerings made by Croesus, the son of Aliates. Now when the Delphians heard what danger they were in, great fear fell on them. In their terror they consulted the oracle concerning the holy treasures, and inquired if they should bury them in the ground, or carry them away to some other country. The god, in reply, bade them leave the treasures untouched. He was able, he said, without help, to protect his own. So the Delphians, when they received this answer, began to think about saving themselves. And first of all they sent their women and children across the gulf into Achaia, after which the greater number of them climbed up into the tops of Parnassus, and placed their goods for safety in the Corycian cave, while some effected their escape to Amphissa in Locris. In this way all the Delphians quitted the city except 60 men and the prophet. When the barbarian assailants drew near, and were in sight of the place, the prophet, who was named Herodotus, beheld in front of the temple a portion of the sacred armour, which it was not lawful for any mortal hand to touch, lying upon the ground, removed from the inner shrine where it was wont to hang. Then went he and told the prodigy to the Delphians who had remained behind. Meanwhile the enemy pressed forward briskly, and had reached the shrine of Athena Pranaya, when they were overtaken by other prodigies, still more wonderful than the first. Truly it was marvel enough when warlike harness was seen lying outside the temple, removed there by no power but its own. What followed, however, exceeded in strangeness all prodigies that had ever before been seen. The barbarians had just reached in their advance the chapel of Athena Pranaya, when a storm of thunder burst suddenly over their heads. At the same time 2 crags split off from Mount Parnassus and rolled down upon them with a loud noise, crushing vast numbers beneath their weight, while from the temple of Athena there went up the war cry and the shout of victory. All these things together struck terror into the barbarians, who forthwith turned and fled. The Delphians, seeing this, came down from their hiding places and smote them with a great slaughter, from which such as escaped fled straight into Boeotia. These men on their return declared, as I am told, that besides the marvels mentioned above, they witnessed also other supernatural sights. 2 armed warriors, they said, of a stature more than human, pursued after their flying ranks, pressing them close and slaying them. These men, the Delphians maintain, were 2 heroes belonging to the place, by name Phylacus and Autonomous, each of whom has a sacred precinct near the temple. One, that of Phylacus, hard by the road which runs above the temple of Pranaya, the other, that of Autonomous, near the Castalian spring, at the foot of the peak called Hyampaya. The blocks of stone which fell from Parnassus might still be seen in my day. They lay in the precinct of Pranaya, where they stopped after rolling through the host of the barbarians. Thus was this body of men forced to retire from the temple. Meanwhile, the Grecian fleet, which had left Artemisium, proceeded to Salamis at the request of the Athenians, and there cast anchor. The Athenians had begged them to take up this position in order that they might convey their women and children out of Attica, and further might deliberate upon the course which it now behooved them to follow. Disappointed in the hopes which they had previously entertained, they were about to hold a council concerning the present posture of their affairs, for they had looked to see the Peloponnesians drawn up in full force to resist the enemy in Boeotia, but found nothing of what they had expected. Nay, they learnt that the Greeks of those parts, only concerning themselves about their own safety, were building a wall across the isthmus, and intended to guard the Peloponnese, and let the rest of Greece take its chance. These tidings caused them to make the request whereof I spoke, that the combined fleet should anchor at Salamis. So while the rest of the fleet lay to off this island, the Athenians cast anchor along their own coast. Immediately upon their arrival, proclamation was made that every Athenian should save his children and household as best he could. Whereupon some sent their families to Aegina, some to Salamis, but the greater number to Troezen. This removal was made with all possible haste, partly from a desire to obey the advice of the oracle, but still more for another reason. The Athenians say that they have in their acropolis a huge serpent, which lives in the temple, and is the guardian of the whole place. Nor do they only say this, but as if the serpent really dwelt there, every month they lay out its food, which consists of a honey cake. Up to this time the honey cake had always been consumed, but now it remained untouched. So the priestess told the people what had happened, whereupon they left Athens the more readily, since they believed that the goddess had already abandoned the citadel. As soon as all was removed, the Athenians sailed back to their station. And now the remainder of the Grecian sea force, hearing that the fleet which had been at Artemisium was come to Salamis, joined it at that island from Troezen, orders having been issued previously that the ships should muster at Pogon, the port of the Troezenians. The vessels collected were many more in number than those which had fought at Artemisium, and were furnished by more cities. The admiral was the same who had commanded before, to wit Eurybiades, the son of Euryclides, who was a Spartan, but not of the family of the kings. The city, however, which sent by far the greatest number of ships, and the best sailors, was Athens. Now these were the nations who composed the Grecian fleet. From the Peloponnese the following: the Lacedaemonians with 16 ships, the Corinthians with the same number as at Artemisium, the Sicyonians with 15, the Epidaurians with 10, the Troezenians with 5, and the Hermionians with 3. These were Dorians and Macedonians, all of them, except those from Hermione, and had emigrated last from Erineus, Pindus, and Dryopis. The Hermionians were Dryopians, of the race which Heracles and the Malians drove out of the land now called Doris. Such were the Peloponnesian nations. From the mainland of Greece beyond the Peloponnese came the Athenians with 180 ships, a greater number than that furnished by any other people, and these were now manned wholly by themselves, for the Plataeans didn't serve aboard the Athenian ships at Salamis, owing to the following reason. When the Greeks, on their withdrawal from Artemisium, arrived off Chalcis, the Plataeans disembarked upon the opposite shore of Boeotia and set to work to remove their households, whereby it happened that they were left behind. The Athenians, when the region which is now called Greece was held by the Pelasgi, were Pelasgians, and bore the name of Cranaeans. But under their king Cecrops they were called Cecropidae. When Erechtheus got the sovereignty, they changed their name to Athenians, and when Ion, the son of Zeuthus, became their general, they were named after him Ionians. The Megarians served with the same number of ships as at Artemisium, The Ambraciots came with 7, the Leucadians, who were Dorians from Corinth, with 3. Of the islanders, the Aeginetans furnished 30 ships. They had a larger number equipped, but some were kept back to guard their own coasts, and only 30, which, however, were their best sailors, took part in the fight at Salamis. The Aeginetans are Dorians from Epidaurus. Their island was called formerly Oenone. The Chalcidians came next in order. They furnished the 20 ships with which they had served at Artemisium. The Erythraeans likewise furnished their 7. These races are Ionian. Chios gave its old number. The Chians are Ionians from Attica. Naxos furnished 4. This detachment, like those from the other islands, had been sent by the citizens at home to join the Medes, but they made light of the orders given them and joined the Greeks at the instigation of Democritus, a citizen of good report, who was at that time captain of a trireme. The Naxians are Ionians of the Athenian stock. The Styrians served with the same ships as before. The Cythnians contributed 1, and likewise a Pentaconta. These 2 nations are Dryopians. The Seriphians, Siphnians, and Melians also served. They were the only islanders who had not given earth and water to the barbarian. All these nations dwelt inside the river Acheron and the country inhabited by the Thesprotians, for that people borders on the Ambraciots and Leucadians, who are the most remote of all those by whom the fleet was furnished. From the countries beyond there was only one people which gave help to the Greeks in their danger. This was the people of Crotona, who contributed a single ship under the command of Phaelus, a man who had thrice carried off the prize at the Pythian Games. The Crotoniates are, by descent, Achaeans. Most of the allies came with triremes, but the Melians, Siphnians, and Seriphians brought Pentacontas. The Melians, who draw their race from Lacedaemon, furnished 2. The Siphnians and Seriphians, who are Ionians of the Athenian stock, 1 each. The whole number of the ships, without counting the Pentacontas, was 378. When the captains from these various nations were come together at Salamis, a council of war was summoned, and Eurybiades proposed that anyone who liked to advise should say which place seemed to him the fittest among those still in the possession of the Greeks to be the scene of a naval combat. Attica, he said, was not to be thought of now, but he desired their counsel as to the remainder. The speakers mostly advised that the fleet should sail away to the isthmus and there give battle in defence of the Peloponnese. And they urged as a reason for this that if they were worsted in a sea fight at Salamis, they would be shut up in an island where they could get no help, but if they were beaten near the isthmus, they could escape to their homes. As the captains from the Peloponnese were thus advising, there came an Athenian to the camp, who brought word that the barbarians had entered Attica and were ravaging and burning everything. For the division of the army under Xerxes was just arrived at Athens from its march through Boeotia, where it had burnt Thespiae and Plataea, both which cities were forsaken by their inhabitants who had fled to the Peloponnese. And now it was laying waste all the possessions of the Athenians. Thespiae and Plataea had been burnt by the Persians because they knew from the Thebans that neither of those cities had espoused their side. Since the passage of the Hellespont and the commencement of the march upon Greece, a space of 4 months had gone by. 1 while the army made the crossing and delayed about the region of the Hellespont, and 3 while they proceeded thence to Attica, which they entered in the archonship of Calliades. They found the city forsaken. A few people only remained in the temple, either keepers of the treasures or men of the poorer sort. These persons, having fortified the citadel with planks and boards, held out against the enemy. It was in some measure their poverty which had prevented them from seeking shelter in Salamis, but there was likewise another reason which in part induced them to remain. They imagined themselves to have discovered the true meaning of the oracle uttered by the Pythoness, which promised that the wooden wall should never be taken. The wooden wall, they thought, didn't mean the ships, but the place where they had taken refuge. The Persians encamped upon the hill over against the citadel, which is called Ares Hill by the Athenians, and began the siege of the place, attacking the Greeks with arrows, whereto pieces of lighted tow were attached, which they shot at the barricade. And now those who were within the citadel found themselves in a most woeful case, for their wooden rampart betrayed them. Still, however, they continued to resist. It was in vain that the Pisistratidae came to them and offered terms of surrender. They stoutly refused all parley, and among their other modes of defence rolled down huge masses of stone upon the barbarians as they were mounting up to the gates, so that Xerxes was for a long time very greatly perplexed, and couldn't contrive any way to take them. At last, however, in the midst of these many difficulties, the barbarians made discovery of an access, for verily the oracle had spoken truth, and it was fated that the whole mainland of Attica should fall beneath the sway of the Persians. Right in front of the citadel, but behind the gates and the common ascent, where no watch was kept, and no one would have thought it possible that any foot of man could climb, a few soldiers mounted from the sanctuary of Aglaurus, Cecrops's daughter, notwithstanding the steepness of the precipice. As soon as the Athenians saw them upon the summit, some threw themselves headlong from the wall, and so perished, while others fled for refuge to the inner part of the temple. The Persians rushed to the gates and opened them, after which they massacred the suppliants. When all were slain, they plundered the temple, and fired every part of the citadel. Xerxes, thus completely master of Athens, dispatched a horseman to Susa, with a message to Artabanus informing him of his success hitherto. The day after he collected together all the Athenian exiles who had come into Greece in his train, and bade them go up into the citadel and there offer sacrifice after their own fashion. I know not whether he had had a dream which made him give this order, or whether he felt some remorse on account of having set the temple on fire. However this may have been, the exiles were not slow to obey the command given them. I'll now explain why I've made mention of this circumstance. There's a temple of Erechtheus, the Earthborn, as he's called, in this citadel, containing within it an olive tree and a sea. The tale goes among the Athenians that they were placed there as witnesses by Poseidon and Athena when they had their contention about the country. Now this olive tree had been burnt with the rest of the temple when the barbarians took the place. But when the Athenians, whom the king had commanded to offer sacrifice, went up into the temple for the purpose, they found a fresh shoot, as much as a cubit in length, thrown out from the old trunk. Such at least was the account which these persons gave. Meanwhile, at Salamis, the Greeks no sooner heard what had befallen the Athenian citadel than they fell into such alarm that some of the captains didn't even wait for the council to come to a vote, but embarked hastily on board their vessels and hoisted sail as though they would take to flight immediately. The rest, who stayed at the council board, came to a vote that the fleet should give battle at the isthmus. Night now drew on, and the captains, dispersing from the meeting, proceeded on board their respective ships. Themistocles, as he entered his own vessel, was met by Mnesiophilus, an Athenian, who asked him what the council had resolved to do. On learning that the resolve was to stand away for the isthmus and there give battle on behalf of the Peloponnese, Mnesiophilus exclaimed, "If these men sail away from Salamis, thou wilt have no fight at all for the one fatherland. For they will all scatter themselves to their own homes, and neither Eurybiades nor anyone else will be able to hinder them, nor to stop the breaking up of the armament. Thus will Greece be brought to ruin through evil counsels. But haste thee now, and if there be any possible way, seek to unsettle these resolves. Mayhap thou mightest persuade Eurybiades to change his mind, and continue here." The suggestion greatly pleased Themistocles, and without answering a word, he went straight to the vessel of Eurybiades. Arrived there, he let him know that he wanted to speak with him on a matter touching the public service. So Eurybiades bade him come on board and say whatever he wished. Then Themistocles, seating himself at his side, went over all the arguments which he had heard from Mnesiophilus, pretending as if they were his own, and added to them many new ones besides, until at last he persuaded Eurybiades by his importunity to quit his ship and again collect the captains to council. As soon as they were come, and before Eurybiades had opened to them his purpose in assembling them together, Themistocles, as men are wont to do when they are very anxious, spoke much to divers of them. Whereupon the Corinthian captain Adimantus, the son of Orchytus, observed, Themistocles, at the games they who start too soon are scourged. True, rejoined the other in his excuse, but they who wait too late are not crowned. Thus he gave the Corinthian at this time a mild answer, and towards Eurybiades himself he didn't now use any of those arguments which he had urged before, or say aught of the allies betaking themselves to flight if once they broke up from Salamis. It would have been ungrateful for him, when the confederates were present, to make accusation against any, but he had recourse to quite a new sort of reasoning, and addressed him as follows. With thee it rests, O Eurybiades, to save Greece, if thou wilt only hearken unto me, and give the enemy battle here, rather than yield to the advice of those among us who would have the fleet withdrawn to the isthmus. Hear now, I beseech thee, and judge between the two courses. At the isthmus thou wilt fight in an open sea, which is greatly to our disadvantage, since our ships are heavier and fewer in number than the enemy's. And further, thou wilt in any case lose Salamis, Megara, and Aegina, even if all the rest goes well with us. The land and sea force of the Persians will advance together, and thy retreat will but draw them towards the Peloponnese, and so bring all Greece into peril. If, on the other hand, thou doest as I advise, these are the advantages which thou wilt so secure. In the first place, as we shall fight in a narrow sea with few ships against many, if the war follows the common course, we shall gain a great victory, for to fight in a narrow space is favourable to us, in an open sea to them. Again, Salamis will in this case be preserved, where we have placed our wives and children. Nay, that very point by which ye set most store is secured as much by this course as by the other, for whether we fight here or at the isthmus, we shall equally give battle in defence of the Peloponnese. Assuredly ye will not do wisely to draw the Persians upon that region, for if things turn out as I anticipate, and we beat them by sea, then we shall have kept your isthmus free from the barbarians, and they will have advanced no further than Attica, but from thence have fled back in disorder, and we shall, moreover, have saved Megara, Aegina, and Salamis itself, where an oracle has said that we are to overcome our enemies. When men counsel reasonably, reasonable success ensues, but when in their counsels they reject reason, God doesn't choose to follow the wanderings of human fancies. When Themistocles had thus spoken, Adimantus the Corinthian again attacked him and bade him be silent, since he was a man without a city. And at the same time he called on Eurybiades not to put the question at the instance of one who had no country, and urged that Themistocles should show of what state he was envoy before he gave his voice with the rest. This reproach he made because the city of Athens had been taken, and was in the hands of the barbarians. Hereupon Themistocles spake many bitter things against Adimantus and the Corinthians generally, and for proof that he had a country, reminded the captains that with 200 ships at his command, all fully manned for battle, he had both city and territory as good as theirs, since there was no Grecian state which could resist his men if they were to make a descent. After this declaration he turned to Eurybiades, and addressing him with still greater warmth and earnestness, "If thou wilt stay here," he said, "and behave like a brave man, all will be well. If not, thou wilt bring Greece to ruin, for the whole fortune of the war depends on our ships. Be thou persuaded by my words. If not, we'll take our families on board and go, just as we are, to Syris in Italy, which is ours from of old, and which the prophecies declare we are to colonize some day or other. You then, when you've lost allies like us, will hereafter call to mind what I have now said." At these words of Themistocles, Eurybiades changed his determination. principally, as I believe, because he feared that if he withdrew the fleet to the isthmus, the Athenians would sail away, and knew that without the Athenians the rest of their ships could be no match for the fleet of the enemy. He therefore decided to remain and give battle at Salamis. And now the different chiefs, notwithstanding their skirmish of words, on learning the decision of Eurybiades, at once made ready for the fight. Morning broke, and just as the sun rose, the shock of an earthquake was felt, both on shore and at sea, whereupon the Greeks resolved to approach the gods with prayer, and likewise to send and invite the Aeacids to their aid. And this they did with as much speed as they had resolved on it. Prayers were offered to all the gods, and Telamon and Ajax were invoked at once from Salamis, while a ship was sent to Aegina to fetch Aeacus himself and the other Aeacids. The following is a tale which was told by Dicaius, the son of Theocydes, an Athenian, who was at this time in exile and had gained a good report among the Medes. He declared that after the army of Xerxes had, in the absence of the Athenians, wasted Attica, he chanced to be with Demaratus the Lacedaemonian in the Thriasian plain, and that while there he saw a cloud of dust advancing from Eleusis, such as a host of 30,000 men might raise. As he and his companion were wondering who the men from whom the dust arose could possibly be, a sound of voices reached his ear, and he thought that he recognized the mystic hymn to Dionysus. Now Demaratus was unacquainted with the rites of Eleusis, and so he inquired of Dicaius what the voices were saying. Dicaius made answer, "O Demaratus, beyond a doubt some mighty calamity is about to befall the king's army, for it's manifest inasmuch as Attica is deserted by its inhabitants, that the sound which we've heard is an unearthly one, and is now upon its way from Eleusis to aid the Athenians and their confederates. If it descends upon the Peloponnese, danger will threaten the king himself and his land army. If it moves towards the ships at Salamis, 'twill go hard, but the king's fleet there suffers destruction. Every year the Athenians celebrate this feast to the mother and the daughter, and all who wish, whether they be Athenians or any other Greeks, are initiated. The sound thou hearest is the Dionysiac song, which is wont to be sung at that festival." "Hush now," rejoined the other, "and see thou tell no man of this matter, for if thy words be brought to the king's ear, thou wilt assuredly lose thy head because of them. Neither I nor any man living can then save thee. Hold thy peace, therefore. The gods will see to the king's army." Thus Demaratus counselled him, and they looked and saw the dust, from which the sound arose, become a cloud, and the cloud rise up into the air and sail away to Salamis, making for the station of the Grecian fleet. Then they knew that it was the fleet of Xerxes which would suffer destruction. Such was the tale told by Dicaius, the son of Theocydes, and he appealed for its truth to Demaratus and other eyewitnesses. The men belonging to the fleet of Xerxes, after they'd seen the Spartan dead at Thermopylae, and crossed the channel from Trachis to Histiaia, waited there by the space of 3 days, and then, sailing down through the Euripus, in 3 more came to Phalerum. In my judgment, the Persian forces, both by land and sea, when they invaded Attica, were not less numerous than they had been on their arrival at Sepias and Thermopylae. For against the Persian loss in the storm and at Thermopylae, and again in the sea fights off Artemisium, I set the various nations which had since joined the king, as the Malians, the Dorians, the Locrians, and the Boeotians, each serving in full force in his army, except the last, who didn't number in their ranks either the Thespians or the Plataeans. And together with these, the Caristians, the Andrians, the Tenians, and the other people of the islands, who all fought on this side, except the 5 states already mentioned. For as the Persians penetrated further into Greece, they were joined continually by fresh nations. Reinforced by the contingents of all these various states, except Paros, the barbarians reached Athens. As for the Parians, they tarried at Kithnos, waiting to see how the war would go. The rest of the sea forces came safe to Phalerum, where they were visited by Xerxes, who had conceived a desire to go aboard and learn the wishes of the fleet. So he came and sat in a seat of honour, and the sovereigns of the nations and the captains of the ships were sent for to appear before him, and as they arrived took their seats according to the rank assigned to them by the king. In the first seat sat the king of Sidon, after him the king of Tyre, then the rest in their order. When the whole had taken their places one after another, and were set down in orderly array, Xerxes, to try them, sent Mardonius, and questioned each whether a sea fight should be risked or no. Mardonius accordingly went round the entire assemblage, beginning with the Sidonian monarch, and asked this question, to which all gave the same answer, advising to engage the Greeks, except only Artemisia, who spake as follows. Say to the king, Mardonius, that these are my words to him. I wasn't the least brave of those who fought at Euboea, nor were my achievements there among the meanest. It's my right, therefore, O my lord, to tell thee plainly what I think to be most for thy advantage now. This, then, is my advice. Spare thy ships, and do not risk a battle, for these people are as much superior to thy people in seamanship as men to women. What so great need is there for thee to incur hazard at sea? Art thou not master of Athens, for which thou didst undertake thy expedition? Is not Greece subject to thee? Not a soul now resists thy advance. They who once resisted were handled even as they deserved. Now learn how I expect that affairs will go with thy adversaries. If thou art not over hasty to engage with them by sea, but will keep thy fleet near the land, then whether thou abidest as thou art, or marchest forward towards the Peloponnese, thou wilt easily accomplish all for which thou art come hither. The Greeks cannot hold out against thee very long. Thou wilt soon part them asunder, and scatter them to their several homes. In the island where they lie, I hear they have no food in store, nor is it likely, if thy land force begins its march towards the Peloponnese, that they will remain quietly where they are, at least such as come from that region. Of a surety they will not greatly trouble themselves to give battle on behalf of the Athenians. On the other hand, if thou art hasty to fight, I tremble lest the defeat of thy sea force bring harm likewise to thy land army. This too thou shouldst remember, O king. Good masters are apt to have bad servants, and bad masters good ones. Now as thou art the best of men, thy servants must needs be a sorry set. These Egyptians, Cyprians, Cilicians, and Pamphylians, who are counted in the number of thy subject allies, of how little service are they to thee? As Artemisia spake, they who wished her well were greatly troubled concerning her words, thinking that she would suffer some hurt at the king's hands, because she exhorted him not to risk a battle. They, on the other hand, who disliked and envied her, favoured as she was by the king above all the rest of the allies, rejoiced at her declaration, expecting that her life would be the forfeit. But Xerxes, when the words of the several speakers were reported to him, was pleased beyond all others with the reply of Artemisia. And whereas even before this he had always esteemed her much, he now praised her more than ever. Nevertheless, he gave orders that the advice of the greater number should be followed, for he thought that at Euboea the fleet had not done its best, because he himself was not there to see, whereas this time he resolved that he would be an eyewitness of the combat. Orders were now given to stand out to sea, and the ships proceeded towards Salamis, and took up the stations to which they were directed, without let or hindrance from the enemy. The day, however, was too far spent for them to begin the battle, since night already approached, so they prepared to engage upon the morrow. The Greeks, meanwhile, were in great distress and alarm, more especially those of the Peloponnese, who were troubled that they had been kept at Salamis to fight on behalf of the Athenian territory, and feared that if they should suffer defeat, they would be pent up and besieged in an island, while their own country was left unprotected. The same night the land army of the barbarians began its march towards the Peloponnese, where, however, all that was possible had been done to prevent the enemy from forcing an entrance by land. As soon as ever news reached the Peloponnese of the death of Leonidas and his companions at Thermopylae, the inhabitants flocked together from the various cities and encamped at the isthmus under the command of Cleombrotus, son of Anaxandridas and brother of Leonidas. Here their first care was to block up the Scironian way, after which it was determined in council to build a wall across the isthmus. As the number of assembled amounted to many tens of thousands, and there wasn't one who didn't give himself to the work, it was soon finished. Stones, bricks, timber, baskets filled full of sand were used in the building, and not a moment was lost by those who gave their aid, for they laboured without ceasing either by night or day. Now the nations who gave their aid and who had flocked in full force to the isthmus were the following: the Lacedaemonians, all the tribes of the Arcadians, the Eleans, the Corinthians, the Sicyonians, the Epidaurians, the Phliasians, the Troezenians, and the Hermionians. These all gave their aid, being greatly alarmed at the danger which threatened Greece. But the other inhabitants of the Peloponnese took no part in the matter, though the Olympic and Carnaean festivals were now over. 7 nations inhabit the Peloponnese. 2 of them are aboriginal and still continue in the regions where they dwelt at first, to wit the Arcadians and the Kinurians. A third, that of the Achaeans, has never left the Peloponnese, but has been dislodged from its own proper country and inhabits a district which once belonged to others. The remaining nations, 4 out of the 7, are all immigrants, namely the Dorians, the Aetolians, the Dryopians, and the Lemnians. To the Dorians belong several very famous cities. To the Aetolians only one, that is, Elis. To the Dryopians, Hermione, and that Asine, which lies over against Cardamili in Laconia. To the Lemnians, all the towns of the Paroriots. The aboriginal Kinurians alone seem to be Ionians. Even they, however, have in course of time grown to be Dorians under the government of the Argives, whose Oriots and vassals they were. All the cities of these 7 nations, except those mentioned above, stood aloof from the war, and by so doing, if I may speak freely, they in fact took part with the Medes. So the Greeks of the Isthmus toiled unceasingly, as though in the greatest peril, since they never imagined that any great success would be gained by the fleet. The Greeks at Salamis, on the other hand, when they heard what the rest were about, felt greatly alarmed, but their fear wasn't so much for themselves as for the Peloponnese. At first they conversed together in low tones, each man with his fellow, secretly, and marvelled at the folly shown by Eurybiades. But presently the smothered feeling broke out, and another assembly was held, whereat the old subjects provoked much talk from the speakers, one side maintaining that it was best to sail to the Peloponnese and risk battle for that, instead of abiding at Salamis and fighting for a land already taken by the enemy, while the other, which consisted of the Athenians, Aeginetans, and Megarians, was urgent to remain and have the battle fought where they were. Then Themistocles, when he saw that the Peloponnesians would carry the vote against him, went out secretly from the council, and instructing a certain man what he should say, sent him on board a merchant ship to the fleet of the Medes. The man's name was Sicinus. He was one of Themistocles' household slaves, and acted as tutor to his sons. In after times, when the Thespians were admitting persons to citizenship, Themistocles made him a Thespian, and a rich man to boot. The ship brought Sicinus to the Persian fleet, and there he delivered his message to the leaders in these words: "The Athenian commander has sent me to you privily without the knowledge of the other Greeks. He is a well-wisher to the king's cause, and would rather success should attend on you than on his countrymen. Wherefore he bids me tell you that fear has seized the Greeks, and they are meditating a hasty flight. Now then, it's open to you to achieve the best work that ever ye wrought, if only ye will hinder their escaping. They no longer agree among themselves, so that they will not now make any resistance. Nay, it is likely ye may see a fight already begun between such as favour and such as oppose your cause." The messenger, when he had thus expressed himself, departed, and was seen no more. Then the captains, believing all that the messenger had said, proceeded to land a large body of Persian troops on the islet of Psytallia, which lies between Salamis and the mainland. After which, about the hour of midnight, they advanced their western wing toward Salamis, so as to enclose the Greeks. At the same time, the force stationed about Chios and Cynosura moved forward and filled the whole strait as far as Munichia with their ships. This advance was made to prevent the Greeks from escaping by flight, and to block them up in Salamis, where it was thought that vengeance might be taken upon them for the battles fought near Artemisium. The Persian troops were landed on the islet of Psytallia because, as soon as the battle began, the men and wrecks were likely to be drifted thither, as the isle lay in the very path of the coming fight, and they would thus be able to save their own men and destroy those of the enemy. All these movements were made in silence, that the Greeks might have no knowledge of them, and they occupied the whole night, so that the men had no time to get their sleep. I can't say that there's no truth in prophecies, or feel inclined to call in question those which speak with clearness, when I think of the following. When they shall bridge with their ships to the sacred strand of Artemis, girt with the golden falchion, and eke to marine Cynosura, mad hope swelling their hearts at the downfall of beautiful Athens, then shall godlike right extinguish haughty presumption, insults furious offspring, who thinketh to overthrow all things. Brass with brass shall mingle, and Ares with blood shall empurple ocean's waves. Then shall the day of Grecia's freedom come from victory fair, and Kronos' sun all-seeing. When I look to this, and perceive how clearly Bacchus spoke, I neither venture myself to say anything against prophecies, nor do I approve of others impugning them. Meanwhile, among the captains at Salamis, the strife of words grew fierce. As yet they didn't know that they were encompassed, but imagined that the barbarians remained in the same places where they had seen them the day before. In the midst of their contention, Aristides, the son of Lysimachus, who had crossed from Aegina, arrived in Salamis. He was an Athenian, and had been ostracized by the commonalty. Yet I believe, from what I've heard concerning his character, that there wasn't in all Athens a man so worthy or so just as he. He now came to the council, and standing outside, called for Themistocles. Now Themistocles wasn't his friend, but his most determined enemy. However, under the pressure of the great dangers impending, Aristides forgot their feud, and called Themistocles out of the council, since he wished to confer with him. He'd heard before his arrival of the impatience of the Peloponnesians to withdraw the fleet to the isthmus. As soon, therefore, as Themistocles came forth, Aristides addressed him in these words. Our rivalry at all times, and especially at the present season, ought to be a struggle, which of us shall most advantage our country. Let me then say to thee that so far as regards the departure of the Peloponnesians from this place, much talk and little will be found precisely alike. I have seen with my own eyes that which I now report, that however much the Corinthians or Eurybiades himself may wish it, they cannot now retreat, for we are enclosed on every side by the enemy. Go in to them, and make this known. Thy advice is excellent, answered the other, and thy tidings are also good. That which I earnestly desired to happen, thine eyes have beheld accomplished. Know that what the Medes have now done was at my instance, for it was necessary, as our men wouldn't fight here of their own free will, to make them fight whether they would or no. But come now, as thou hast brought the good news, go in and tell it. For if I speak to them, they will think it a feigned tale, and won't believe that the barbarians have enclosed us around. Therefore do thou go to them, and inform them how matters stand. If they believe thee, 'twill be for the best, but if otherwise, it won't harm, for it's impossible that they should now flee away, if we are indeed shut in on all sides, as thou sayest. Then Aristides entered the assembly and spoke to the captains. He had come, he told them, from Aegina, and had but barely escaped the blockading vessels. The Greek fleet was entirely enclosed by the ships of Xerxes, and he advised them to get themselves in readiness to resist the foe. Having said so much, he withdrew, and now another contest arose, for the greater part of the captains wouldn't believe the tidings. But while they still doubted, Athenian trireme, commanded by Panaetius, the son of Sosimenes, deserted from the Persians and joined the Greeks, bringing full intelligence. For this reason the Athenians were inscribed upon the tripod at Delphi, among those who overthrew the barbarians. With this ship, which deserted to their side at Salamis, and the Lemnian vessel, which came over before at Artemisium, the Greek fleet was brought to the full number of 380 ships. Otherwise it fell short by 2 of that amount. The Greeks now, not doubting what the Athenians told them, made ready for the coming fight. At the dawn of day all the men-at-arms were assembled together, and speeches were made to them, of which the best was that of Themistocles, who throughout contrasted what was noble with what was base, and bade them in all that came within the range of man's nature and constitution, always to make choice of the nobler part. Having thus wound up his discourse, he told them to go at once on board their ships, which they accordingly did. And about this time the trireme that had been sent to Aegina for the Iacidae returned, whereupon the Greeks put to sea with all their fleet. The fleet had scarce left the land when they were attacked by the barbarians. At once most of the Greeks began to back water, and were about touching the shore, when Arminius of Pallene, one of the Athenian captains, darted forth in front of the line and charged a ship of the enemy. The 2 vessels became entangled and couldn't separate, whereupon the rest of the fleet came up to help Arminius, and engaged with the Persians. Such is the account which the Athenians give of the way in which the battle began, but the Aeginetans maintain that the vessel which had been to Aegina for the Iacidae was the one that brought on the fight. It's also reported that a phantom in the form of a woman appeared to the Greeks, and in a voice that was heard from end to end of the fleet, cheered them on to the fight, first, however, rebuking them and saying, "Strange men, how long are ye going to back water?" Against the Athenians, who held the western extremity of the line towards Eleusis, were placed the Phoenicians. Against the Lacedaemonians, whose station was eastward towards the Piraeus, the Ionians. Of these last, a few only followed the advice of Themistocles to fight backwardly. The greater number did far otherwise. I could mention here the names of many triarchs who took vessels from the Greeks, but I shall pass over all except Theomestor, the son of Androdamus, and Phylacus, the son of Histiaeus, both Samians. I show this preference to them, inasmuch as for this service Theomestor was made tyrant of Samos by the Persians, while Phylacus was enrolled among the king's benefactors and presented with a large estate in land. In the Persian tongue the king's benefactors are called orosangs. Far the greater number of the Persian ships engaged in this battle were disabled, either by the Athenians or by the Aeginetans, for as the Greeks fought in order and kept their line, while the barbarians were in confusion and had no plan in anything that they did, the issue of the battle could scarce be other than it was. Yet the Persians fought far more bravely here than at Euboea, and indeed surpassed themselves. Each did his utmost through fear of Xerxes, for each thought that the king's eye was upon himself. What part the several nations, whether Greek or barbarian, took in the combat, I am not able to say for certain. Artemisia, however, I know, distinguished herself in such a way as raised her even higher than she stood before in the esteem of the king, for after confusion had spread throughout the whole of the king's fleet, and her ship was closely pursued by an Athenian trireme, she, having no way to fly, since in front of her were a number of friendly vessels, and she was the nearest of all the Persians to the enemy, resolved on a measure which in fact proved her safety. Pressed by the Athenian pursuer, she bore straight against one of the ships of her own party, a Calindian, which had Damascenus, the Calindian king, himself on board. I can't say whether she had had any quarrel with the man while the fleet was at the Hellespont or no, neither can I decide whether she of set purpose attacked his vessel, or whether it merely chanced that the Calindian ship came in her way, but certain it is that she bore down upon his vessel and sank it, and that thereby she had the good fortune to procure herself a double advantage. For the commander of the Athenian trireme, when he saw her bear down on one of the enemy's fleet, thought immediately that her vessel was a Greek, or else had deserted from the Persians, and was now fighting on the Greek side. He therefore gave up the chase, and turned away to attack others. Thus, in the first place, she saved her life by the action, and was enabled to get clear off from the battle, while further it fell out that in the very act of doing the king an injury, she raised herself to a greater height than ever in his esteem. For as Xerxes beheld the fight, he remarked, it said, the destruction of the vessel, whereupon the bystanders observed to him, "Seest thou, master, how well Artemisia fights, and how she has just sunk a ship of the enemy?" Then Xerxes asked if it were really Artemisia's doing, and they answered, "Certainly, for they knew her ensign," while all made sure that the sunken vessel belonged to the opposite side.